to Different Perspectives. I'm Paul Ndiho. The United States has quietly begun deporting migrants and not to their home countries, but to third-party countries in Africa. Under secretive deals, Rwanda, South Sudan, and Eswatini have agreed to receive deportees the United States labels as dangerous and undocumented. So far, 8 men have been sent to South Sudan, 5 to Eswatini, and Rwanda has agreed to take in 250. To help us unpack what this means for international law and Africa's role in this program, I'm joined by David Osorio Monda, a journalist and professor at the City University of New York, Gatman Community College. Hello, David.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Start off, what are the legal and ethical implications of the United States deporting migrants to African countries that are not their home nation?
There's two main angles, right? So there's the domestic legal question about the deportations within the context of the U.S. Constitution and due process, um, and an infringement of that right of migrants or of anybody accused or in removal proceedings to have a fair and speedy trial, right? So there's a big challenge when you think about the U.S. Constitution, domestic law, and even common law, right? The U.S. copies a lot from the British common law. There's very difficult challenges around due process in terms of just forced removal of people. But there's also an international angle in terms of international law, the idea, the theory of refoulement. And this is the idea that you cannot deport Paul Ndiho, who is fearful for his life, to Turkey if Turkey is a human rights abusing government, or Turkey will prosecute and violate Paul Ndiho's rights, right? So if you're going to deport someone to a second or third country, you have to be sure that their rights will be protected there, and the rights of the individuals going to those countries will also be, upheld. So there's a significant international law precedent, which goes against what the U.S. is doing right now. And but however, I must add, unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has tended to take a very restrained view of these laws, right? So they've tended to give the Trump administration very broad leeway in terms of determining how these migrants will be removed. And this has become an ongoing challenge in terms of immigrants' rights and deportations, because we now see individuals from Venezuela, from Mexico, from China getting deported to South Sudan, a country that they've never been, they don't know it. And conditions in South Sudan, as we know, are not very immigrant friendly. The country is still in major crisis. And then, of course, the other question is Rwanda, right, which recently signed this agreement with the U.S. And we know about the concerns with Rwanda's human rights record, and just the rights of the deported people or the people in removal proceedings, are not guaranteed to be protected. So at a domestic level, in terms of U.S. Constitution, there's major challenges in terms of due process, but also in terms of the international law precedent of non-refoulement, right, and deporting people to second or third countries where they won't be, where their rights are not guaranteed to be protected. I think there's also challenges in that, in regards to that.
Let me do some quicker follow-ups on two things. One,
Yes.
whether this is a legal process or not. I think even the United States Supreme Court has weighed in. So in a way, they have cleared the path for the administration to do that. Then you also raised the issue of refoulement. I think that what does the international law say about that, specifically the principle of refoulement, about sending people or individuals to third party countries like Rwanda and South Sudan, or and Eswatini for that matter. What does
Right.
the law say about that?
Right. So to deal specifically with your first question, so the law says that, if um, an individual, Paul Ndiho, for example, in this case, is in removal proceedings, he should undergo due process, which means you must exhaust the legal process in terms of accessing justice. And at that point, should you be, being deported, to either a second country, say to Eswatini, or even a third country, that those countries should be safe, and you should be sure of your rights and protection of your rights. The challenge with the current situation is this. Number one, if you look at the three countries in Africa that have been targeted, there are three landlocked, small, poor countries. Rwanda is landlocked, Rwanda is poor. South Sudan is landlocked, South Sudan is poor. Eswatini is landlocked, Eswatini is poor. And the reason I say that is because within the context of non-refoulement, these countries have very unstable political systems and have been known to be human rights abusing governments, not only of their own people, but also of foreigners. Now, the legal and political process then converge in this context because we see three small landlocked poor African countries that are being forced by the US to take these immigrants in, and it really creates a narrative or a scenario of asymmetrical power because you have
But wait
one
a minute.
giant.
The US is
Yes.
not forcing these countries. They are in agreement with each other. I think both
Co-
all these countries have come to terms and they said, "Hey, we want to cooperate in this area."
Right, but my point is, it's not it's not it's not a negotiating table of equal powers, right? So there's a coercive element in terms of negotiating with the US. It's a David Goliath situation, right? It's an elephant and an ant situation. Yes, if you put an elephant and an ant on the same table, they'll be talking to each other. But obviously, you cannot not realize that one is so much bigger than the other, right? So there's, even though the ant might accept the conditions of the elephant, there is a coercive element around the context of these negotiations, right? And maybe let me put it in terms of a more broader perspective. Countries like South Sudan are very wary that, for example, if they do not take these migrants, that, for example, Trump might give South Sudan 50% tariff penalty, right, as a retribution because South Sudan did not accept what US wanted. When we look at Rwanda, as we know, has big concerns around its human rights record. And Rwanda is desperate to get US support on its interference in the extraction of minerals and rare minerals in the DRC. So by Rwanda also playing to the US's tune on this question of migrants, Kagame administration is also very hopeful that US will be more favorable to the Rwanda position on other international contexts, and specifically with Rwanda's concerns around the DRC. And when you look at then about Eswatini, we know about the king in Eswatini and some of the concerns he's been having with human rights issues, the declining economic conditions in Eswatini, right? So even though these countries, yes, on paper might say, we both agree with these terms, there is, a very subtle, coercive nature in terms of these negotiations. It's not of equal partners, is what I'm saying, right? You have an elephant and an ant on one, on both sides of the table. One is a giant, a hegemon, a superpower, and another is a landlocked, poor, developing African country. But I must add, apart from the political and legal questions here, Paul, we also have very ethical questions. It doesn't look good when the US is dumping dangerous criminals, in the words of the Trump administration. These are, enfants terribles, right? These are malcontents. These are criminals. These are killers, these are murderers, these are drug dealers, these are very violent criminals. And it looks very unethical and unfair that these individuals who have never been to Africa are being dumped on the continent. You remember Trump, the negative words he used, calling Africa shithole countries. So it really plays into that other element of this very unethical and unfair scenario that's being painted, that these criminals, these unwanted individuals are being dumped on the continent. It's almost like Africa, these African countries are becoming the dustbin, the dump yard for America's rejects. Because for sure you'd imagine the UK or France or Russia or China would never accept these conditions. And we've actually seen, Kenya was approached to accept these undocumented rejects, and the government refused. Nigeria has also refused, and other big African countries were approached and rejected it. So there's not only the political and legal questions, Paul, but we also have to understand the ethical question. It doesn't look good in the picture of these countries. But the unfortunate thing in the context of Rwanda, Eswatini, and South Sudan is that they're not democracies, they're autocracies. And the people in those countries don't necessarily have a say in terms of what will happen. So it's essentially led from the top, and it's the executives of these countries that have determined that they should and will accept these refugees or these deportees.
The Trump administration is not the first one to do that. We can go back even to the Obama administration. They had these arrangements in place where they would send asylum seekers to these third-party countries. So this is the Trump administration is not setting a new precedent. This is something that has been ongoing. It's maybe the only difference is that now they're targeting these quote-unquote hardcore criminals that are being sent to different third-party countries.
I would push back a little bit on that because it's not the same context, say, with the Obama administration. And the reason being, one, the Supreme Court had not taken a position of judicial restraint in terms of siding along with the executive. In terms of the Obama administration, they wanted to do some of these deportations, but a lot of these deportations were challenged in court to say that if an individual is undocumented, they have a legal right to due process. Let's also remember, Paul, that these individuals in removal proceedings, are in very complex situations. Take, for example, an individual, Paul Ndiho, who does not have a passport. He looks Somali or looks Ethiopian, but the US government cannot verify that Paul Ndiho is Ethiopian or Somali. In other words, I'm talking about stateless people. Is it really fair to deport someone to Eswatini whose country of origin we don't know and who has not been through due legal process? Right? I think that's one element. Second element is it's different with the Trump administration because the Trump administration wants to speed up these deportations, which goes back to the other question of due process, right? Obama administration wanted to deport individuals, but they had very major legal constraints, similar with the Biden administration. But with Trump, it's very much a fast track. And it's then a big concern around the Fifth Amendment protections of due process and due process rights. And the reason I say that is that if Paul Ndiho, a Ugandan, or Muhammad, a Somali, can be deported to South Sudan, that really erodes the fundamental protections of rights even for US citizens. Because eventually, if the rights of foreigners are being infringed upon, the government, which has a monopoly to the legitimate use of violence, will eventually start violating the rights of citizens.
If I hear you correctly, you seem to suggest that, at least in your view, that the United States is using some of these African nations and some countries in the global south as political dumping grounds for its immigration challenges.
Very much so, very much so. And I would also say, Trump is a very transactionalist leader, right? So he's very much about US material interests. is also very much about America first. And the challenge then with these forced or these deportations of these individuals to these second and third countries is think about it. You know, what happens to an Iraqi or Venezuelan who's been deported to Kigali? You know, if they protest against the government in Rwanda, what will their fate be? You know, I mean, it's fairly obvious that in many cases, these individuals will be, will be eliminated, right? Because they're not only not wanted in the U.S. If they bring any trouble in Rwanda, they will probably be disappeared. Very much like the administration in Kigali has done with its own Rwandans, not only in Rwanda but also the way it's sought out and persecuted opponents of the Rwandese government abroad. But I also must add that if we're going to talk about legal precedent, the UK Supreme Court has ruled that these deportations, this program that, for example, Rwanda wanted to have with the UK, were illegal. And the Starmer administration had to roll back because it not only violated UK law and common law, of which the US Constitution borrows heavily, but it also violated EU law, European Union law. This idea that if you get to the Canary Islands or Gibraltar or any territory of the EU and you file for asylum or claim, immigration relief, you have to get due process. And this also applies to the US, right? Crossing the border illegally into the US is not a felony, it's a misdemeanor. And the reason that is constructed in our constitution is the US has always been, it's a country founded by immigrants, as a safe haven for those fleeing for their lives. So if you cross the border because a gang in Mexico wants to kill you, the government cannot then again turn around and prosecute you for trying to save your life, right? And this is where these forced deportations become very troubling, because then you're telling people that America is no longer, the US is no longer a safe haven, right, for the tempest tossed, right, for these huddling masses yearning to breathe free. The Statue of Liberty, Emma Lazarus, right, this idea that America is the safe haven for the world's prosecuted and people trying to, to save their lives. So just on a whole range of questions, this becomes very troubling.
Going back to the point that you made, how should these African governments respond, especially when it comes to the issue of human rights that you raised? Uh, their citizens are largely unaware of what some of their leaders are doing. And when it comes to also to hosting some of these deportees, these citizens that you talked about have no say in what their countries are doing. How should these governments handle that?
I think at this point it's a fait accompli, right? So it's already happened. So many of these countries like Rwanda is going to do what the Kagame administration wants. So it's South Sudan. They have so many internal problems. You look at the issues in South Sudan around the stability of the government of Salva Kiir, and of course Eswatini has its own individual challenges and dynamics. I think. I think at the AU level, and this is again another challenge with African foreign policy. We've not had the AU make itself clear on this question. Addis Ababa, the capital of Africa, is completely silent. So we don't have an African voice in terms of a common approach to this question. And also, let's not forget, Paul, that these forced deportations, these infringements of international law, are not only a violation of US law, of international law, but the AU Charter itself, right? The preamble is centered around protection of human rights and due process, right? So even these countries that are accepting these migrants are in violation of the AU Charter itself, right? And the fundamentals of the African Union. So, to answer your question, I think we really need to reimagine how we interact with the US as a continent, right? Every country, yes, can have its own foreign policy, but I really also think there needs to be a re engagement with how as a continent we interact with the US, because the magic with the Trump administration is divide and conquer. So US would rather deal with Eswatini and US. Remember the elephant and the ant, because it's a very asymmetrical relationship, and the US has leverage because it's a very unequal negotiating process. Now, imagine if the elephant was able to meet all 55 African countries at the same table. Now it's not the elephant and the ant, but you have an elephant and an elephant negotiating at the same table. You have two continental giants. And this is the challenge that the Trump administration has been looking to circumvent, right? So they would rather deal bilaterally with individual countries rather than work within multilateral frameworks, say within the AU or the United Nations protocol, where they will not only face, for example, in the context of UN, they'll not only face Africa, but they will face the global south together, meaning South Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And that's a very different proposition. So I think, again, to answer your question, it really needs to be a rethinking in terms of, what will the African continent policy be on these migrants? And if the three African countries have accepted to host these, deportees who have not been through due process, then what happens to the other 52 African countries? We now need to rethink that. I think Kenya and Nigeria have been very clear that they will not accept these deportees. But many other African countries are very desperate and poor, to be clear and frank. And if it's a transactional um, bilateral negotiation, like what happened between the US and Rwanda, where essentially the US is paying Rwanda to accept its rejected deportees, right? Many African countries would accept a transactional, pay for play kind of situation with the US, where US pays them to accept these deportees, and they will then accept them. So again, we really need to reimagine how we approach this question, in particular because there's 52 other countries that still might be targets of some of these Trumpian policies. But I think even more broadly, within the global south, we have the non-aligned movement, we have the BRICS, multilateral frameworks. How do countries of the global south in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, how do they start to reimagine how they're going to negotiate and leverage against the US? Because this elephant and ant scenario will be replayed multiple times across the globe. And it really does not sit well for the protection of not only due process, but also human rights and the upholding of international law.
How would you respond to some of the supporters who are excited about this program, saying that one, it targets hardcore criminals. Secondly, they are giving these countries, take for example, these African countries, they are giving them an opportunity really to sit on the same table here. You talked about the elephant and the ant. Yes, there is that scenario playing out, but at the same time, these countries have, instead of them asking for aid, they're like, hey, what can you do for us in return, in exchange for these migrants coming to our countries? We've seen South Sudan are using that as leverage. They want, in exchange for these deportees, to lift some of the sanctions on their country, to reinstate issuing of visas to their citizens. Rwanda is playing the same game. I don't know about Eswatini, but at least those two countries have expressed interest that they want to engage the United States at that level. How do you respond to that?
I think that's very problematic, for one, because it narrows international affairs to very transactionalist and material dealings. And that's very problematic because, international affairs is not only about instrumentalist dealings, right, between different countries in terms of how governments interact within the structures of international relations. It's not only about material interests, but it's fundamentally about norms, about ethical and also legal questions. And within those three baskets, I talk about norms, right? It's about this idea internationally that will uphold the highest standards of protection of individual liberties at a global level, right? Within the international community of nations, as domiciled within the United Nations Charter, as domiciled within the Rome Treaty and the Rome Statutes, the international law precedent around non-refoulement, but also domiciled within ethical questions about the right thing to do. That if the US is, as we mentioned, the elephant and the ant, it's using its coercive power simply because it's an elephant, a giant, to force other countries to follow its lead. That may be well and good, and the US may get away with that, but it really then raises questions about the legitimacy of US leadership, right? So this is less about material and transactional interest, but it's more about legitimacy questions, which are a lot more also very important within international relations. So there's
But
norms
wait a minute.
questions. Yes.
Wait a minute. The US argues that this is more strategic. I think for them, they are looking at it as a strategic way of engaging than coercion.
Right, and it's strategic, and you're very right. And like Rwanda might argue, it's very much within its strategic interest, right? Because it wants leverage with the US, not only on this question to be in the good books of the US, but that the US will also see Rwanda as a major partner, within the Great Lakes region. You're exactly right. It's very much a pay for play, very much centered on core national interests. But I have to then again push back on that and say international relations is not simply about material and national interests. International relations is also about norms, about values, and about legal international structures. Because if countries disregard the laws, if countries disregard norms, right, what has heretofore been accepted law about how we treat the weakest of these deportees, it really raises many legal questions, many legitimacy questions, but also it really undercuts, in the context of US leadership as a global leader in terms of democracy and human rights. So you're very right. Countries can narrow this down and say it's purely about national interest. It's very much transactionalist, but we still cannot deny the fact that if these countries are part of an international community and are signatories to international treaties that specify that these norms around the law, around human rights have to be upheld, then it really undercuts the legitimacy of those countries when they're engaging in international dealings and in terms of legitimacy to their to their rights as good stewards, right, or as upstanding citizens within this community of nations that we call the global community.
But David, there are people who would argue that at the end of the day, all these international norms, all these international laws that you are talking about, they really don't matter. What matters is strategic and national interests. All these countries are looking out for themselves.
Yes, and there's those who've argued that, but the pushback on that will always be that we without a rule of law, And without upholding these norms, the world will very quickly degenerate into a Hobbesian um, um, environment of chaos, right? Thomas Hobbes, English philosopher, talking about this environment of all against all, right? Of might over right, right? Just because you're the most powerful doesn't necessarily mean you can run roughshod over all the weaker people, right? All the weaker nations. We have to have certain upstanding norms and laws, not only to protect the strong, but more importantly, to protect the weak. So it's a very interesting dynamic there, right? Just because the US is the most powerful, just because Russia is the most powerful, Russia can't just invade its neighbors just because it can, right? You have to respect territorial boundaries and international law. Similar with the US. And on this immigration question, this forced deportations, international law has to be upheld because it not only protects the rights of the smaller nations, but it also entrenches and reinforces the legitimacy of the superpowers. If the US is constantly violating international law, is only centering its international relations around its national interests, eventually what's going to happen is all these smaller and weaker nations are going to gang up together and one time come against the US. Very much a scenario of the spiders and the lion, right? When the spiders unite, they can tie down the lion, right? In this Ethiopian proverb. So my analogy with that, with the spiders and the lion, is that the international law not only protects the might of the lion, but also safeguards the interests of the spiders. Because eventually, if the lion keeps attacking the spiders and destroying their webs, what's going to happen? All these spiders are going to gang up together and one day tie down the lion and destroy the lion, right? So very much people could argue, critics could argue and say international relations is only about rational perspectives and national interest, but we cannot undermine international norms and the fair administration of justice globally, but also the international norms and international law and international rules to the game in terms of how nation states interact, right? That we have to have this fair administration of justice globally. It's not only about material interests, but it's also about a rules-based international order centered around norms and international legal precedent. That together with national interests, I think, is the way then to advance international affairs when we come to some of these questions.
Well, David, you are always very insightful when it comes to some of these things. I guess we leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a lovely rest of your day out in North America.
We want to know what you think about the US deporting migrants to third party countries in Africa. Share your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Paul Ndiho on Substack, X, Instagram, Threads, Facebook, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and YouTube. And we are also streaming on Spotify.